you're cheating with EVs because all you're doing is transferring the exhaust fumes from your car to the power station because your car is powered by coal and coal produces more pollution than your my petrol car does. You're cheating. Have you heard that one before? Let's have a look at the grid and see what's actually going on because it's getting quite interesting out there. I'm Dave. Welcome to Dave Takes It On. We're looking today at the grid and renewable energy. Now, when the grid first started, we were talking back in the 1930s. The only fuel we had then to do anything in any large quantity was coal. The whole world ran on coal at one point, steam engines and coal-fired furnaces for steel and coal fires in the home. Everything was coal. So in the 30s, 40s, 50s, we burned coal everywhere. And that's where it started. The power stations, when they started springing up in the 40s and the 50s, they were almost all coal-fired power stations as well. So absolutely, back then, they were horrendous. But then they started producing too much pollution. We started getting smogs. People started dropping dead prematurely with respiratory diseases and pneumonia, bronchitis, all the lung diseases. And then in 1957, they introduced the Clean Air Act, which said you can't do that anymore. And since 1957, there's been a gradual decline in the use of coal. It's been quite noticeable, but in the last 5 or 10 years, it's taken a real steep dive. Today in the UK, we have just one coal-fired power station left, and that one is scheduled to shut down this year. So for the first time since the grid started in 1938, we are going to end up with a situation where we don't have a single coal-fired power station in the whole of the UK, not even as a backup. Now, what are we replacing it with? Well, in the early 60s and 70s, the flavour of the day was natural gas, straight from the North Sea. Natural gas came in really cheap. They had a slogan at one time: it's going to be so cheap we're going to have to pay you to burn it, and they virtually did. Gas became the number one king. We switched all our coal fires over to gas central heating, or gas fires. We switched our coal-fired power stations over to gas-fired power stations. And the beauty of those is they are very much cleaner. The gas that they were using, natural gas, is mostly methane. We didn't know at the time how dangerous it is for the atmosphere, but that's beside the point. It's mostly methane. They put a chemical in it to make it smell like gas on its own. It doesn't smell very much. And gradually our grid changed from coal to gas. In the late 50s, early 60s, again, we started dabbling with nuclear. So we ended up with Windscale, which has since become Sellafield because it's such a toxic name, they can't use it anymore. And then we got Dungeness and Sizeable B and A and B. So we started installing nuclear power stations. And they seemed to be the answer to everything. That was until we realised the amount of nuclear radioactive waste that they leave. Would you believe that the radioactive waste from the very first nuclear power station in the UK at Sellafield, we still haven't got rid of it. We don't know how to get rid of it, and it's still dangerous to this day. It's got a half-life of like 10,000, 100,000 years. It's going to be around forever. And a lot of stuff they've had to encase in glass to try and stop it radiating or reacting, and then they submerge the gas in massive big underground water tanks to try and keep them cool. This is waste. There's a nuclear reaction going on in this waste. It's producing heat, and they have a vitrification plant which seals it in glass, and then they drop that glass into a deep water pond. So we're starting to find out that nuclear does have its drawbacks. I know the latest ones are cleaner, but I used to work, I was a HVAC, heating, ventilating, air conditioning engineer. I used to work at Sellafield. I would go up there for visits, and everything I wore before I went in there, I had to take off and store in a locker, shoes, socks, pretty much everything, just down your underpants. And then you'd be given an overall, and you had to sit on a bench and swing your legs over and then put that on, so there's no cross-contamination. And everything you used, all your clothing, everything you touched, it could all potentially be radioactive the other side of this barrier. When you come out, you have to strip everything off, that goes into low-grade waste, nuclear waste. So everything I've just worn is now waste, radioactive waste. And then you stand virtually naked in front of a monitor which checks it, and you have to put your fingers in because you can get radioactive traces in your nails and your hair. So they do all that. So these were found to be not so good after all. There's so much money being needed to get rid of the waste, or try and get rid of it, that the cost of disposing of the radioactive waste is now greater than the power station itself. France has got a different issue. They went all electric in the 60s. Massive investment, huge investment, private and government. And they went about 80% nuclear, literally overnight, 80% nuclear. The trouble is, all of those nuclear power stations in France, all built at the same time, the 60s and 70s, they're all now coming to the end of their life. And France has a really serious, they have two problems actually. The first problem is these are all reaching the end of their life, and they are now so expensive to try and build a new one because of all the safety measures and the radioactive waste that we now know about, that they can't afford to replace them all with new nuclear power stations. They haven't got the money, and they can't get the investment to do it. The other problem they had was a really interesting one. Now, don't go into global warming, but they are claiming that the temperature's rising. As temperatures rise, they're starting to get a few droughts. We saw this last year in Germany with the Rhine drying up, and we've seen it in this country with rivers drying up and hosepipe bans. And over in France, that's really, really hitting them hard because all nuclear power stations need cooling water. The radioactive reactor produces huge amount of heat. That heat flashes water into steam. The steam drives turbines, and that produces your electricity. But you have to cool it all down at the end of it, otherwise the whole reactor overheats. So there's a cooling water. And 2 years ago, they found, to their horror, that they had two problems. The first problem was they were often built, smaller ones, on riverbanks, and they would just divert some of the water through it. But when the water levels started dropping with the droughts, like it did on the Rhine, they couldn't even run the barges up and down the Rhine. Then they found that they couldn't get enough water through the reactor to cool it down. The second thing was that water was hot. Well, I'd say relatively hot. It was really warm water. So not only did they have enough water coming through, but they didn't have enough cooling effect. And so in the heat waves that they had in France, particularly in Paris a few years ago, they were actually throttling back the nuclear power stations not because they couldn't open them up, but because they couldn't cool them down fast enough. And they had widespread blackouts and everything caused purely because not enough water. Now, whether you like global warming or not, we are seeing more droughts. We're seeing more rivers drying up. We're seeing temperatures rising, temperatures of oceans rising. So even for Sellafield, which is on the coast, the water temperature, if that goes up a couple of degrees, that will have an impact on the cooling capacity. On top of that, if we are getting sea level rises, which they're predicting, and they're saying some island nations are already affected, then at some point these are going to flood. They're going to be underwater. So because you have to build them in the UK down on the coast, right down sea level, so you can get seawater into them, that means that if and when the sea level rises, they're finished. You have to shut them down. But how do you shut down a nuclear reactor? You can't. We know that because we've still got all the radioactive waste from the ones back in the 50s and 60s. So we're having a big problem with nuclear reactors. So one of the answers is, let's turn the grid green. Let's go renewable. Oh, you can't do that, everyone says. In actual fact, they're doing it. Give you one example. The grid here has said that December last year, year before last, they had a total of 5 days where we didn't use any fossil fuels at all. So over the years, we've added solar panel farms, we've added wind farms, we've added hydroelectric, we've added pumped water storage, we've added a lot of things. We've added biomass, growing and burning fuels. And on a typical day now, any day at all you look, in daylight, when the panels are working and potentially the wind farms are working, we can be running 40, 50, 60, 70% off renewable. We don't use the coal anymore. The backup is gas and nuclear. But on a typical day, looking over several days, you'll find that renewables are in the 40, 50% range. Gas is down less than 10%. Nuclear is less than 10%. The rest is made up through PV and other things like that. Now, at night, you can't use PV panels. They don't work. They need sunlight. But the wind turbines still go round, so they will still produce at a background level overnight. And that's when demand drops, so there's a lot less needed, a lot less demand on the grid, and therefore the wind turbines can cope quite happily. So overnight, the percentage is now heading towards wind farms and renewable. With the advent of grid-connected batteries, we can now look at going actually totally renewable. And that is because during the day, if it's a lovely sunny day in the middle of summer and the wind's blowing and the sun's shining, then your panels are producing far, far more power than you can possibly use in the whole of the grid. Your wind farms are producing far more electricity than you can possibly use in the whole of the grid. And currently, that one is just shut down. Literally shut down. So they'll switch off the wind farms, they'll switch off the solar panels because we just don't need it. So we can go hours in a day during sunlight, and we can go hours in a whole day with wind where we're actually switching them off and running gas turbines in case. So we have a crazy situation at the moment. Now, with the advent of grid storage batteries, that is coming to an end. It's already happened big time in Australia. They used to hold coal-fired power stations back to fire up specifically at peak times. They're called peaker plants. And they would run flat out for a number of hours. They'd charge an extortionate price for the electricity, and then they'd shut down for the rest of the day until they needed again 24 hours later. Crazy situation, but Australia was a coal state. They had a change of government brought in renewables, and now they've all gone. All those coal-fired power stations, they're pretty much all gone. And what's happened, they've got massive big batteries in. So while all this sun is shining, the wind's blowing, they're pumping all this electricity, excess, not using it, into batteries, massive batteries, and they're storing it. And then when there's a sudden demand on the grid and it's greater than what they're producing supplies, they just release it back from the batteries back into the grid. There's always been a problem in the past with something called balancing, but in actual fact, batteries, when they're programmed properly, are a better balancing than a gas-fired power station. In the UK, the grid has said by 2025, most days will be running 100% off renewable energy during certain hours. 100%. So that day in December, just over a year ago, when we had 5 days of continuous use with no fossil fuel being burnt at all, we're going to be getting those as regular as clockwork within 1 year now, 1.5 years. So grids are heading towards renewable. We need a final effort because what we need to do is keep on building up the renewables. Now, when we have excess, we need to build up the battery storage as well, because if we can store, for example, a whole day's electricity in the batteries, then it means that we just top it up throughout the day. Simple as that. We don't need any other sources of electricity. We're heading towards that, and the grid has announced they're quite happy to do it. Now, I know a lot of people have a go at me. It's not the grid, it's the DNOs. No, it's not. It's the grid. See, the way the structure works in the UK is you have power stations. So they can be private, they can be global, they can be owned by the grid, they can be owned by a utility company like Egan, they can be owned by me, it could be my panels on the roof, right? These are all power stations. The grid's job is to take in all that power and get it into the grid and then distribute it so it is available where it is needed. And this is all the high voltage stuff. You're talking about the overhead pylons, 330, 450, 800, 1000 volts. This is massive stuff. So the grid takes electricity from the grid, puts it into the grid network, and then that goes out to each area. Now, in each area, so for example, Preston, It's then brought down from 330, 440,000 volts to a substation, which then drops it down to about 30,000 volts, 40,000 volts, something in that region. Dramatic drop down. And at that point, this effectively is a ring main. It's a lower voltage ring main, still 30, 40,000 volts. That ring main is controlled by the DNOs, the distribution network organizations, and their job is to take the ring main, tap into the ring main and produce substations, which are much smaller, that will bring it down even further, down to just a few thousand volts. Then from the substation to the end load, which might be a supermarket or a shop or a charging installation, that's the responsibility of the supermarket or the shop or the charger network. So that's it. So getting electricity into the grid is part of the grid's problem, and getting it round the country so it's available for everyone to be able to draw what they need, that's the grid's problem. The DNO takes over to then drop the voltage down and put it into areas where it will be needed, and then to drop it from there down into a substation, which then can be worked on by electricians, nothing to do with the grid, nothing to do with the DNOs. It's very strictly defined. So the grid is saying it can go renewable. Now, from a DNO's point of view, it doesn't matter. As long as the DNO can tap into this ring main, as I call it, 330,000 volts, whatever rate it is, or 11,000 volts, as long as they can tap into that, their job then is to distribute that to various stations and substations to make it available for domestic homes and businesses locally. Doesn't matter where that comes from. It's not the responsibility of the DNO. Gets confusing because someone like Eon is everything. They are a DNO. They own part of the grid. They actually have their own power stations. They run nuclear power stations and buy it in from Europe. It gets confusing with certain people who think that because they actually own a power station that they're the DNO. No, they all have their set tasks. So the generators feed it into the grid. The national grid feeds it out to wherever it's needed. The DNOs will take it over. So from a DNO point of view, they don't care where the electricity comes from, unless the DNO is owned by Eon, which has its own power plants. And then there's a power struggle, yeah. There's a battle going on because they want their electricity into the grid first. So when you can break that chain, and all the electricity coming in is from wind farms and solar farms and tidal, the grid itself can go renewable, and that will happen probably by 2030. By 2030, if we carry on as we are, which I think we will, we'll reach a point where all the electricity will be renewable while it's running. Solar panels during the day, wind day and night. And what we can't use there and then, we will store, and the storage element of it will go up. And so over time, we will end up with more electricity than we need, and more of it stored than the worst day can throw at us. This is not very far away. Now, at that point, people say, oh, we need we need nuclear in the background. You don't. So we are heading very rapidly towards it. Now, at that point, it gets very interesting, because once we break away from the gas and the nuclear, we end up with a situation where, why have we tied our electricity price to the price of gas? At some point, people are going to say, we don't want to be tied to gas. We're going to set our own prices. We'll have our own grid, we'll have our own pricing, and we'll be able to sell it for whatever we want. And we won't be beholden to OPEC controlling the price of oil and gas. And we won't be beholden to the Middle East, who provide our gas, or the North Sea, or whatever it is. We'll just be merrily making our own. And you can envisage a situation where there's so much electricity from renewable resources, because we won't stop, we'll just keep making it, because we have interconnectors. So if we produce too much, we should be able to sell some of that across the channel to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, or into Europe, and actually have an export business. But just picture the scene. This is going into fantasy now, but at one day you have so much electricity that they can't get rid of it. We have it today. Electricity sometimes goes negative. The grid will pay you to take electricity out of it because there's so much coming in. Happens now. If one day we produce so much electricity every day that we can't use it all, they'll be saying, look, please take it for free. Take it for free. So you can get some of your industries now will run furnaces, glass making plants, car plants, and they'll be running off free electricity simply because there's so much out there free that they can't use it all. Other times you'll have to pay for it, so you're going to be getting a variable tariff, but could be quite exciting. I'm looking forward to that day, but also it'll clear up the skies of smoke and smog, and that will please me. Well, thanks very much for watching. I'm Dave. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when we release the next video. And thanks for watching. I'm Dave.